I think despite the gloom, despite the political chaos, there are still some good things. Let me just reflect a little bit on climate and clean energy. Just a few weeks ago, the International Energy Agency released new figures for the total amount of investment in energy in the world. This year is projected to be $3.3 trillion in energy investment, but of which 2.2 will be invested in clean energy and 1.1 in fossil fuel. And that's a very good sign for a change. So something good is happening. And for Asia, as an example, China stands for most of those investments, and China invests just as much as the EU and US in total will do, okay? Where things are weak is in Africa, for example, because only 2% is invested in Africa, and Africa has 20% of the world's population. Hence, it's very good with the focus on finance also to emerging developing markets. I also want to say that I've been working in the COP space for more than 16 years, so I've been to many COPs. I have learned over those years, especially because when I started working with the COP was when we had the COP in Denmark in 2009. They tried to make a global legal agreement, and that was not possible. Then we got an agreement, the Paris Agreement, which more is like guiding a long-term process to collaborate together. And I think that we also need to limit a little bit our expectations, what the UN system can provide. I think the UN system is there as a safety valve for us listening to the poor people, the poor nations, those in need. So we don't just think of ourselves, us that are wealthy and have the things to do. So I think that's important with I would say, a realistic view of what we can expect of the UN system, and that business and other platforms need to shape up to do that. Anyway, I'm here to talk about 1/3 of the equation to solve the Paris Agreement, nature, so to speak. So from Glasgow to Kunming, from TNFD to the Global Biodiversity Framework, the global agenda is shifting, from carbon-only strategies to nature-positive pathways. And this shift is about more than compliance or disclosure. It's about redefining value creation, about financing that restores rather than depletes the ecosystem we all depend on. So today, I'd like to share how Asia, and particularly Taiwan, is not only responding to this shift, but also leading it. We know the numbers. The world faces a $700 billion annual biodiversity financing gap. Half of global GDP depends, moderately or heavily, on nature, and yet only 17% of land and 10% of oceans are protected. In response to this, new frameworks are emerging. The TNFD is helping firms disclose nature-related risks and dependencies. The Global Biodiversity Framework Target 19 calls for innovative financial mechanisms, including biodiversity credits. And the financial sector is evolving through biodiversity bonds, insurance-linked nature finance, and natural capital accounting. So nature is no longer a soft issue. It is becoming investable, measurable, and material. And in that light, Asia is stepping forward as one of the key centers of nature-positive innovation. South Korea launched the 30 by 30 Alliance, aligning national and corporate conservation goals. Japan has formally integrated over 200 OECD sites into ESG reporting frameworks. Indonesia is piloting the biodiversity tax regimes and blue carbon strategies. Across the region, governments are advancing blended finance, biocredit initiatives, and sovereign nature plans. What unites those efforts is a common belief that nature-positive solutions must be regionally grounded, locally driven, and globally connected. Taiwan stands at a unique intersection where scientific credibility, financial capacity, and civic engagement converge. And it's Cathay Financial Holdings that exemplifies what it means to lead from that intersection. Since 2017, Cathay Financial Holdings has hosted this summit not just to discuss sustainability, but to shape it. This year, I understand, with participants representing 82% of Taiwan's market cap and 54% of national emissions, this gathering is more than a forum, it's a platform of influence. As a long-standing partner of the World Climate Foundation, I've had the privilege of witnessing Cathay's journey from early leadership on TCFD adoption to renewable energy financing to integrating climate risk into investment decision-making. Now, Cathay is once again stepping forward, expanding its leadership from climate to nature. This includes supporting the development of high-integrity biodiversity credit frameworks in Taiwan, especially for foothill and forest ecosystems. Partnering with leading research institutions such as National Taiwan University Experimental Forest, which we'll hear from later, to ensure that credits are science-based, locally relevant, and globally credible. And engaging actively in international dialogues like the World Biodiversity Summit and Nature Investment Dialogues. These are not isolated actions. They reflect a systemic effort to integrate nature into the core strategy of sustainable finance. One particular promising initiative is the Asian Biodiversity Credit Coalition, led by regional academic and scientific institutions, with Taiwan's research community playing a central role. This coalition spans 8 Asian countries, working to co-develop regionally appropriate methodologies, culturally informed safeguards, and practical tools for scaling biodiversity investments in Asia. This quiet but powerful movement signals a new area. Asia will not just participate in the emerging nature markets, it will help design and lead them. business leaders in Taiwan, this transition presents real and timely opportunities to assess nature-related risk across value chains, to prepare for TNFD-aligned disclosures, to unlock new investment models, biodiversity credits, nature-linked loans, and sustainable forestry, and perhaps most importantly, to meet rising expectations from stakeholders, investors, and society around regenerative business models. For policymakers, this is a momentum to enable market infrastructure through supportive regulation, recognize the value of conservation beyond traditional protected areas, including OECMs, and position Taiwan as a hub for nature-positive finance and innovation in the region. So friends, we are at a crossroad. We can treat nature as a constraint, or we can embrace it as a catalyst for innovation, resilience, and long-term value. I believe that Taiwan, through the leadership of institutions like Cathay Financial Holdings, has the vision, the talent, and the trust to lead the world in this new era. As we shift from climate to nature, from risk to regeneration, let us build models that restore ecosystems, deliver returns, and inspire the next generation. Because in the end, nature is not just our responsibility, it's our shared advantage. And so I leave you with this. From Taipei to the world, let this summit not be the end of a conversation, but beginning of a coalition. Let's make it count. Thank you very much.
那我们都知道，川普要格陵兰，也要巴拿马。为什么要格陵兰呢？大家觉得他是个疯子。台湾有格马兰，怎么不要？为什么要格陵兰？我们来看一下北极的地图。左边这个是北极，从地球的上空往下照，在北极的入口这个地方呢，是美国的阿拉斯加。以前北极是一块冰，那没有办法过船。但现在因为气候暖化，一块冰要融化的时候，先从两边开始融。所以在现在在北极已经出现两条航道，一个是贴着加拿大的边边可以到美国去，一个是贴着俄罗斯的边边可以到欧洲去。所以现在这条北极航道变成兵家必争之地。川普为什么要格陵兰？大家可以看到，在北极海的入口有美国阿拉斯加，但出口没有美国啊，所以美国如果能够占有格陵兰，它就可以把这条北极航道掌握在手上，以后呢船就可以自己走了。那格陵兰除了那个航道以外，它还有什么用处呢？美国拿到一个阿拉斯加吃了200年，右边大家可以看到，北极还有全世界没有开采的石油15%，还有全世界没有开采的天然气30%，光是这些北极的石油跟天然气，美国可以再吃200年。所以从航道、从能源的角度来看，川普对这个地方势在必得。那我们讲北极航道，真的有人在走吗？不是只有北极熊呢？我们来看一下，在这个地方，俄罗斯的石油这2年因为俄乌战争被禁运，所以先看到右边这个地方，俄罗斯的石油现在各国都不能买。只有中国跟印度2个拼命买。好，那他要载到中国跟印度的石油，他是怎么载过去的呢？第一个，我们看到蓝颜色是在战争之前，俄罗斯的石油还没有现在这么密集，但自从战争之后，它的油别人都不买，它只能载到印度去。所以你看到那个橘色的，先从左半边往下跑，经过苏伊士运河，然后到印度去。所以左边下面有个黄点，这个是印度。另外一个载到中国大陆呢，除了苏伊士运河可以过以外，你有没有看到它从上面走？它走北极，绕到刚刚的阿拉斯加，再绕下来。所以北极航道是真的有船在走，而且已经变成俄罗斯摆脱经济制裁的一个重要工具。川普看到了，难道不眼红吗？美国也想卖油，美国也想挖油，所以格陵兰对他来说至为重要。下一个是巴拿马运河，巴拿马运河最近因为天灾、声音现象，所以水干掉，本来一天可以过40艘船，现在只能过20艘船。如果你是南美洲的国家，比如说你要从秘鲁到巴西，本来是6天走巴拿马运河，现在因为巴拿马运河干了、断了，所以你必须要去绕南美洲。大家看南美洲好像地图很近，其实南美洲是绕到南极再绕回来，折返跑，所以要从6天变31天，时间多5倍。亚洲呢，本来从台湾高雄载个东西到美国的东边去，本来是26天，或者是你要从美国买石油，美国墨西哥湾有石油嘛，如果再过来26天，但现在因为运河中断了，你要去绕南美洲，那太远了，所以这些亚洲的船现在不走太平洋，倒回来走大西洋走过来，时间从26变39天。最后一个也是最重要，美国呢，美国原来从左半边从旧金山载个东西到欧洲去是21天，现在如果要走南半球，美国在北半球，绕南半球等于绕世界一圈，那还是别绕了吧。他们把很多东西并在一个货柜里面往亚洲载，先把亚洲的东西拿去卸货，再载到欧洲去。所以自从巴拿马运河水干掉以后，大家天下大乱，大家不是看到最近李嘉诚也在开始跟港口有关系吗？那对于美国来说，为什么巴拿马运河一定要拿到呢？我们先看上面这个图，美国在那个俄乌战争之前，美国的墨西哥湾产石油，它的石油可以往欧洲，可以往亚洲，也可以走巴拿马运河再过来，所以那个时候它两边通。但自从巴拿马运河干掉以后，大家看到下面这个图，它的墨西哥湾挖出来的石油现在不能叫墨西哥湾，改名叫美国湾了。它的美国湾挖出来的石油现在只能往右边载，左边都给你断掉，所以他一直想要拿掉巴拿马运河，就是因为它的航道受阻，军舰受阻。所以对于美国来说，对俄罗斯来说，北极航道格陵兰跟巴拿马运河是它兵家必争之地。听完了你就知道，川普并不是个疯子。2017年他要争取的是贸易逆差的改善，现在贸易逆差他不管了，他要争取重要的航道、能资源、关键战略物资。所以乌克兰的稀土、巴拿马、格陵兰还有台积电，他必须要拿到手，只有拿到手，贸易逆差才会减少。第一个，中国大陆这几年大家都知道它的不动产表现不好，所以呢这2年他们都有刺激政策。2024年他们推出的是货币政策，降准降息。现在要做的是财政政策，哪一些是财政政策呢？第一个是消费，补贴消费，他们今年要补贴3000亿，跟去年比的话多1倍，补贴民众换家电、换汽车。第二个是他们现在鼓励大家生小孩，所以第2个小孩补贴500，第3个小孩可能会补1000，地方政府可以，中央也可以。第3个是养老金跟医疗保险的补贴，所以第一个是消费补贴。但是中国大陆过去消费大概都不会成长太快，投资是它最重要的动能。所以我们看到中国大陆第一个要设备升级，要投资2000亿人民币，它的设备已经够好了，它现在还升级，那对台湾的石化、钢铁、造纸来说，你会面临非常高的压力。第二个就是它还要提供很多的科技专案，所以我们现在看到 或许台湾5G 还没有完全普遍，中国大陆6G 已经出来，再加上美国它的 AI 大部分都是纸上谈兵，都是在网络上问问题，但中国大陆是真的把 AI 跟红绿灯、跟智慧城市、跟无人机、跟机械人结合在一起，所以中国大陆在应用端很厉害，所以接下来它要投资更多，这些都是我们台湾要特别注意中国大陆的发展。过去日本失落30年，是因为日本有宽松没创新，日本的公司都是老公司，但中国大陆只要它有持续有新公司、新的产业出来，中国大陆要摆脱过去这段时间的阴霾就不是那么难的事情。但中国大陆现在也要遇到美国对它的贸易战，但美国对它的贸易战跟8年前相比，你会发现市场好像金融市场好像都没什么反应，为什么呢？我们先看左边这个图。美国的进口来源在8年前，中国大陆是第1名，22%。但过去这8年，中国大陆占的比重越来越低，越来越低，现在只剩下13%，连墨西哥都比它多，印度、越南还有台湾现在都超过了中国大陆。为什么会这样呢？因为中国大陆过去这8年，因为跟美国打贸易战，它把很多要生产的东西搬到别人家那边去做。大家要特别注意，不是所有的都搬走，只有把要卖到美国那一部分搬走。美国只占全世界市场的13%，干嘛全部搬走呢？所以下面大家看到进口橱柜，美国进口的橱柜以前都大陆做的，现在大陆不做，都别人做。另外右边这个图大家可以看到，2017年的时候，中国大陆在很多产品上面，它卖到美国的比重都是60%，比如说半导体、手机、灯、笔电、平板、包包。但是8年后的今天，它的比重已经都从60%降到2-3%。所以既然中国大陆现在卖的东西比以前少很多，美国对它课关税就课不到了，因为它没有卖你，你也课不到。所以川普这次的关税可能要找别人去课才有用，中国大陆反而不是最重要的重点。
Organizations establish and disclose governance structures for sustainability-related risks and opportunities. We'll touch on board and management roles, oversight processes, and how these are integrated into broader risk and decision-making frameworks. So this sets the stage for the panel conversation that you'll hear shortly. Now, who will be our speakers today? So to lead off the discussion in a moment, we have Michael Jency. Michael is an ISSB board member with over 30 years of experience in responsible investment and sustainable finance, and he is the founder of Sustainalytics. And I want to welcome our guest speakers who will be bringing expertise from their respective organizations. So today I'm joined by Jen Sisson, CEO of the International Corporate Governance Network, or ICGN, and Tara Nabate, Director of Research and Thought Leadership for CPA Canada. Welcome to all of you. So the purpose of our discussion today is to explore how companies are establishing and communicating effective governance processes in the context of sustainability-related financial disclosures. The IFRS Foundation offers a number of programs and resources, including our website and our Knowledge Hub, and it has more than 200 resources from the IFRS Foundation and our capacity building partners. Then we have the IFRS Sustainability Alliance, which is a membership program for education, tools, and peer networking, and the Fundamentals of Sustainability Accounting Credential, or FSA, which instills the link between sustainability and financial performance. And finally, on our main website at ifrs.org, you can sign up for alerts. Please remember that your use of our resources and participation in our programs also does support us on our mission as a non-profit standard setter. So please stay involved with our foundation, and including through this webinar series where we'll have more episodes. And you can follow us on LinkedIn and with news updates to learn more about the series, when we'll be covering a variety of topics such as transition planning, scenario analysis, and you can also listen to the monthly ISSB podcast to stay up to date. So I'm Himani Fadke with the IFRS Foundation, and on behalf of the team here, thank you very much for participating. And until next time, thank you and goodbye.